I'll go ahead and there's the fun stuff. So the meeting is going to be recorded, and we're going to put the recordings up shortly, probably by the end of tomorrow. We will have those up, and you can be able to find all of our workshop for registrations and workshop like videos and materials. You'll find them on the Give Local website, which is spsgives.org, which I'll go ahead and put in the chat here shortly. And yeah, you can go there and there's a little tab at the top that says nonprofit workshops, and you can find all of this information. There is also the available option for if you need subtitles. If you go on your screen, there should be like 3 little dots that say more. And when you go under there, there should be an option that says like live transcript. And that way you can kind of turn that on and you can see that, because I know sometimes for me, I need both the visual and also just like the written stuff to read to understand what's happening. But yeah, so there's those. And going back a little bit, backtracking a smidge, on the spsgives.org website, you can also find our next upcoming workshop is going to be on July 1st, so in about 2 weeks. That one is going to be from Three Girls Media, and they are hosting one called Utilizing PR and Media Relations to Reach Your Audience and Boost Donations. So that'll be a good one to kind of help folks with strategizing for Give Local and other online presence and fundraising efforts that you all have. And then we have another one at the end of July from Window Seat Media that's going to be on July 27th. That's called Nonprofit Storytelling, Moving Beyond Curated Storytelling. And this one's going to be a 2-part workshop. But I will let you go ahead and get online and check those out for a little bit more detail. But I just wanted to let you know that those are available. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to Daisha, our Director of Community Programs. I always forget the title. I'm terrible with it. But yeah, so I will let her introduce herself and keep going.
Hi, everyone. My name is Daisha Versailles, and as Melissa said, I'm the Director of Community Programs here at the Community Foundation of South Puget Sound. And I won't take up too much time. I just want to welcome you all and say that we're really glad to have you all here, and also welcome Elaine. We have been so grateful to have Elaine in our community and just her very community-centered way of approaching story. And so we're really looking forward to what she has to share. And with that, I will pass it off to Elaine.
Thanks, Daisha. Thanks, Melissa. And thank you all for being here. It's great to be with you and to spend a little time thinking about nonprofit storytelling. So I wanted to give a little bit of background about who I am and kind of how I come to this topic and this field. I'm an oral historian, so that's kind of my background as an undergraduate. And when I moved into graduate school, I sort of focused more on anthropology and folklore and journalism. So I've always been really interested in story, both the way we tell our stories verbally through oral history, but also the many ways that we tell our story through food traditions or dance or music, our rituals and other traditions. So that's kind of the perspective that I'm coming from. So a lot of oral history, a lot of ethnography that I've done working with communities that way. And when I was in graduate school, I kind of layered on top of that the media pieces. So when I was an undergraduate, I did mostly audio recording and written narratives. And then when I moved into graduate school, I kind of learned particularly the video production side of it. And so on the same token, I've spent a lot of time just academically and just through my work itself, thinking about how to work with communities to tell stories, particularly if you're an outsider to that community. How do we do that ethically? Can we do that ethically, be an outsider and work with communities to tell their stories? So that's kind of the frame where I'm coming from. When I came to Olympia, I worked in the nonprofit sector for a while as a development director. So I've been involved in fundraising and communications at the Film Society first, and then spent about 6 years at the Dispute Resolution Center in that capacity. So I've been thinking about kind of that intersection of sort of fundraising nonprofit storytelling and the storytelling that I've really been trained to do, which is more of oral history-based storytelling. So that's a little bit about where I'm coming from. And the workshop focus today will really be about those personal experience narratives. So there's lots of ways that we tell stories, particularly on social media these days. There's lots of ways to use video. And we're going to focus primarily today on sort of those personal stories that we're telling, working with our program participants or clients to tell stories of impact. So before I launch in, I wanted to just get a little sense of some of you in the room. We probably won't have a chance for everybody to introduce themselves, but I thought as a way to sort of ground ourselves together, I wanted you to think about, and we'll spend just a minute or two, think about what fundraising means to you. So if you were to boil it down into a word or a phrase, what does it mean to you to fundraise, to be, what role does it play kind of within your community? So maybe just take a minute or so to think about that, and then I might ask a few people to share. Does anyone want to share what fundraising means to them? You can unmute yourself and introduce yourself, maybe say your name, your organization, your role, and maybe the word or phrase that comes to mind, or maybe it's words. Don't be shy.
I would say, I don't know if you can hear me. My name is Ryan. I'm with Thurston County Volunteer Legal Services. I think fundraising, the point of that is to obviously raise money to help vulnerable people. But I think part of that process is connecting with community members. And for lack of a better term, I guess, convincing them to give to donate their money or their time to help you.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. So that idea of community connection is definitely at the center of fundraising. Anybody else want to unmute themselves and share?
We have a couple in the chat. So we got from Megan, we have resource distribution, asking, an opportunity, and work. And then we also have from Shauna, we have money equals mission, relationships, and fun. We also have from Nicole, hi all, I'm the Director of Development at Grub. The words that come to mind for me are connection, interdependence, and intersectionality.
Great. Those are all really good. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, it sounds, I like the way that everybody is framing fundraising, because I think a lot of times we can feel hesitant or not wanting to do it, but really framing it in that way of sort of redistribution, connecting with our community, strengthening our community, that it's fun, can be fun. Is all really great. Okay, so I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. And I'm going to share my screen. I have a presentation that will kind of follow along. All right. All right, so as I mentioned before, we're really focusing today on personal narratives, storytelling, nonprofit storytelling using sort of personal narratives. And I guess I would say I have a few goals for today. I want to our workshop's going to be more sort of big picture. So I do want to kind of go over some storytelling conventions and how those have been applied to the nonprofit sector. We're going to explore a little bit about the power dynamics and the ethics of telling other people's stories, and then also offer some guiding principles for sharing personal stories. So those are kind of the primary goals for today. And I wanted to just say that, when I've worked with organizations and, when I've been a development person, I feel like this idea of video comes up a lot. So it's like, we want to fundraise, we need a video. That's usually like a lot of how things happen. And I think that, it makes sense. We're a visual culture, videos are engaging. But I think before you get started, just even thinking about whether, like, how is a video going to help you achieve X, whatever it is, community connection, redistribution of funds, whatever you might think about fundraising. And do you need a video specifically? Are there other ways or more engaging or impactful ways of getting the same results? So, if you're really wanting to engage your donors in the issues that you're tackling at your organization, are there other less expensive ways that you can do that? Can you do, really simple, repeatable, more educational events where there's, an expectation of an ask involved, or, are there other things that you can do? Because video is expensive. It's expensive and it's time consuming. So, when I've worked with organizations, often if you hire a production company, it can be anywhere from like $2,500 to $5,000. It's important to have a dedicated staff person or somebody who's really dedicated. It could be a volunteer, but somebody who can kind of serve as that point person of the production company, to be the liaison. Videos also can get outdated pretty quickly. So when we're thinking particularly of personal experiences, you might do a wonderful video on a program participant, and you might find that 6 months later, their circumstances have really changed. Maybe they're not involved in your organization anymore, and the story is outdated. And so you spent a lot of money to do this video that you can't really use for very long. So you just have to think about, what's your, what's the lifespan of the video, and is the investment worth that? Telling other people's stories can cause unintentional harm. We all, are doing the work that we do because we love our communities, and we have great relationships with our program participants. And sometimes we can unintentionally harm through those storytelling. So one example might be is, maybe you do a story with a family that you're working with, and you're not totally explicit, not on purpose, but of how you're going to use the video. So the family might not know that you have a huge following on Facebook and tons of people are watching your content, and their child's involved in the video, and then the child goes to school and somehow gets teased or something. So just being aware that those things might be happening. So that's always an important consideration. And then videos need to be pretty short. So typically these videos online are now, 3 minutes tops, even less than that. So just thinking about, if you're doing stories of impact with your program participants, how can you tell a story within that time frame that sort of respects the fullness of their lives? So these are just some of the things to keep in mind as you move forward with your video production. So I wanted to review a little bit about nonprofit storytelling, the tradition that we're our storytelling has grown from, and kind of how it relates to just general storytelling conventions. I'll start with talking about modes, storytelling modes. So this is how we narrate or tell our stories. And there's 3 kind of primary modes of storytelling. There's kind of the personal, which is the stories that we tell about our personal experiences to an issue. Maybe it's, our personal stories about childbirth, or our stories with gun violence, or our stories, if we've experienced homelessness. So like all of these personal experiences. So that's sort of the one mode of storytelling. And then there's this sort of communal mode. So it's about thinking about how we tell a story about a community, how we might situate that person within this larger communal narrative. And a community could be, place-based, the community of Olympia or Lacey, or it could be, your faith community, or a cultural community that you're a part of. So it's another mode of storytelling. And then there's sort of the political, which is the global, national, or historical context. So that's just a kind of a larger frame of reference. So with nonprofit storytelling, we've typically, the formula has typically been around emphasizing sort of the personal mode of storytelling. I think most of us are familiar with the idea of framing. But framing really is the process that sort of determines what to include and exclude. And there's a variety of devices that you use to frame your stories. So in one way, you can think about framing as a camera lens. So how much context do you provide? So here's kind of, again, to the left is our sort of modes of storytelling. So you might tell a story about an unhoused person in Olympia. That's kind of that personal mode. You might open your lens further and kind of share a story about the issues that contribute to homelessness. So maybe it's lack of housing stock or affordable housing, and you might tell that person's story with that context in mind. You might widen your frame even further and talk about maybe historical trends over time within our community around houselessness, or you might connect our local community to larger national or regional trends. And the choices that we make around context really helps to educate our donors in our community about the issue. So just keeping context in mind is really important, and thinking about what type of engagement or response your framing inspires. And some framing devices. So I talked about all these different framing devices. So, we make decisions around the visuals. How are we visually representing our story? What sort of tropes are stories using, or metaphors? So often in nonprofit storytelling, some of the a really dominant trope, I would say, particularly around sort of more donor-centric fundraising, is the sort of donor or the organization being sort of the hero of the story. That's a common trope within nonprofit storytelling. How are we using numbers in our stories? Music, I think we all can relate to music being a really powerful tool to kind of evoke different emotions. Who's telling our story? Who are our messengers? Who are we inviting to tell our stories? So those are some framing devices. So I think we're somewhat familiar with, I imagine, if you can think back to your English classes in college or high school, the typical story arc for personal narratives. There's some kind of introduction where, the main characters in the setting are introduced. There's usually some kind of inciting incident, and there's a bunch of conflict that happens, and then, their story comes to a climax, and then things are sort of resolved and there's some falling action. So that's kind of in our culture, sort of the basic sort of story arc and how we understand stories. And so I think, our nonprofit storytelling tradition has really grown from that. And this is from a guide that somebody gave some years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, kind of that applies that storytelling structure to nonprofit storytelling. And it's the same, a lot of our storytelling follows that same arc. And the main thing is, like I mentioned before, is kind of the organization or the donor is kind of introduced as sort of the hero of the story often in sort of our conventions with nonprofit storytelling. So where we've come from essentially is kind of focusing on our personal mode, focusing on an individual, often focusing on deficits such as addiction or homelessness. Often our stories follow a pretty simple story arc. The messengers are often sort of people of color or marginalized, people from marginalized communities sharing kind of personal details of their lives. The organizational voice, often in these stories, there's an organizational voice that's kind of a voice of authority or knowledge. So that's kind of how the messengers are often presented. And we talked a little bit about tropes. And then often it's relying on sort of emotions of pity or charity. I think that's kind of where our tradition has come from. So the Frameworks Institute is a really helpful resource that you could look into. They're really as a way to sort of encourage moving away from episodic to more sort of thematic storytelling. So episodic being more of the sort of personal mode of storytelling, and the thematic being more of the communal or political mode. Again, you know, thinking about the telephoto versus the sort of more wide angle lens. So that's a great resource, and they provide lots and lots of examples of kind of how to do that. And they also kind of show the differences and outcomes from this type of storytelling. So I think a big piece is around kind of, like I mentioned before, the what kind of outcome you want from your donors. Do you want people to feel sort of more pity or charity, or is it more of a sense of empowerment and shared responsibility? So the thematic is really focusing more on the issue. And it's not to say that you can't also do more personalized storytelling, but it's more about centering the issue and the person in relationship to that issue, if that makes sense. So context is really, really important. Providing that context. So I'm gonna, let's see, let me come out of here for a second. I'm gonna provide a couple examples of stories. And the first one is that sort of conventional way that nonprofits have done storytelling for a long time. And then I wanted to show another example that actually isn't like it's not a fundraising video, it's actually a TED Talk, but I just wanted to give you an example of how personal storytelling can be woven in a way that is maybe a little bit more empowering and more a way that sort of helps us understand our role within that community. So I'm going to just share my screen again. Hang on just a second. All right, I got to get to the right place. So as you're watching these videos, I want you to take note of the sort of mode. So how are they telling the story? What are some of those framing devices they're used? So think about, you know, how they're using visuals, or what the tone is like, who are the messengers that are sharing the story? What kind of tropes or use of language are they using? How wide is the frame? I'll put this in the chat too. All right, so I'm going to start with this one. So I'm just going to put in the chat, just as you're watching, just what to take note of. Oh, and I think I need to, sorry, hang on a second. I think I need to add the audio.
When I was pregnant with Jennifer, I was living with my mom. I was 15 years old. I was working with my family on the weekends, and I was still going to high school. I was partying and I was drinking, and then the drugs came around, and everything progressed. I saw myself losing a job and ended up having to give up my apartment and go into treatment.
When I heard that she was there, I was happy, but yet I was upset because then I was homeless. When I did have a home, I didn't appreciate it, so when it was gone, it was hurtful.
There's really been an explosion of homelessness in New York City in the last few years. We're at the highest level since the Great Depression. There are nearly 60,000 people living in a city shelter every single night.
I went into a homeless shelter with my little one, Juliet.
Since 1967, Project Renewal has served single men and women. We felt that it was important for us to begin to address this added crisis of family homelessness. We started in Casa nearly 2 years ago to house homeless families.
And Casa picked me up and gave me an apartment. I was totally in shock when the case manager over there told me, listen, you got approved and we already got somebody that's looking for an apartment for you. It was an overwhelming feeling of relief.
Lisa was chosen for the program because she was a great interview. She was very open and honest about her substance abuse history, and you could tell she was committed to making a change and making a better life for herself and her children.
My mom had told me that she was getting help by Project Renewal and that she will be waiting for an apartment. Then I would be able to move in with her.
Walking into the home, it felt like I was free. Felt like freedom. And I could finally have my family together again. Project Renewal has helped us all in many different areas. My case manager, I can talk to her about anything. It's just like I'm an open book with her.
Every client here, including Lisa, has faced homelessness, which is an incredibly traumatic experience. Lisa also struggled with substance abuse history, and she has been able to not only just pull herself up, but really succeed. She now holds down a job. Her oldest daughter that's living with her is also doing an amazing job raising her granddaughter.
I am a full-time student. I'm doing part-time in my internship, and it's getting me steps closer to my ultimate goal, which is to be a restaurant owner. It is great to have a family in one apartment.
They work well as a family unit, and they've really been able to succeed, which is what you want to see in a family program.
I love my mom. She's caring and she's loving and she understands every situation.
We're really excited that we're going to begin construction soon on our first permanent housing project that will include apartments for families. We just see that as adding to a rich mosaic, and everybody can support everybody and allow all families to achieve their highest potential.
I'm able to go on vacations. I'm able to provide for my family. I'm able to come home in a straight state of mind and not lose myself out there doing things I have no business doing. And if it wasn't for Project Renewal, I don't know where I would be. It's totally, I don't even know the word for it. It's awesome.
All right, so I want to share a different, I'm realizing it's already 10:30, this is going by quickly, but the other video that I wanted to show is actually 10 minutes long, so I might stop it partway through just for purposes of time, but I just wanted to show you, I just want you to keep taking note of those things that I put in the chat, and we'll kind of talk a little bit more about it in terms of thinking about how we can widen our frame on our stories. So this is actually a video that was from the TED Talk, the TED event that happened in Olympia in 2015, I think, and it's Meg Martin talking about interfaith works in the shelter that she started. So, and I just want to just give, just as a way to show you how different stories can be framed and how it inspires different emotions. All right, just a second.
I had my first psychotic break at the age of 22. I was experiencing visual hallucinations and became frozen with fear in the shower because I was convinced that there was a man on the other side of the curtain that was going to hurt me when I came out. At this point, I had been self-medicating my depression, anxiety, and trauma with drugs and alcohol for 9 years. I had my second psychotic break at the age of 24. An angel of death visited me and told me that I needed to die in order to truly know God. Luckily, before I walked out into traffic that day, I called my dad, and he talked me down. At this point, I had been self-medicating with drugs and alcohol for 11 years. After my second break, I moved home. My depression and addiction had spiraled out of control. I was on a slow path to suicide. This culminated in a heroin overdose, in which I stopped breathing for several minutes and came back for no clear reason. I was able to get into a quality treatment program quickly, but I was hospitalized first in the psychiatric inpatient unit because I was suicidal and hearing voices. I was able to break this cycle in my life, and the real reason is because I have a family that's deeply dedicated to my well-being, that have the money to send me to the treatment program that I needed at the time. But after treatment, I had nowhere to go. I had burned many of my bridges, but luckily a dear friend in Olympia said that she would take care of me if I came here. So I did. I soon became involved in a volunteer street outreach program that provides emergency services to street-dependent people in downtown Olympia. The Emma Goldman Youth Homeless Outreach Project, or Eggy Hop as it's known on the streets, really changed me. I was meeting people that were dealing with many of the same things that I had been dealing with. Serious mental health symptoms, in some cases living in active addiction, but there was one really important difference. They didn't have money to get the help that they needed quickly and the help that they were asking for. I often hear, we have so many services for people in Olympia experiencing homelessness. This is true. What we also have is many wait lists. You can wait sometimes weeks, months, or even years to get into a shelter bed, housing, chemical dependency treatment services, get connected with mental health help, or even a medical provider, even if you're actively trying to do this every single day. So what we've done is essentially create a network of services that screens out the people that need it the most, people that have a hard time navigating through all of those hoops that you have to jump through to get help. In the winter of 2012, the city of Olympia was set to pass a series of ordinances that would negatively affect the lives of people living on the streets. A camping ban on city-owned public property and restricted use of the sidewalk between the hours of 7 a.m. and midnight each day. Myself and two of my close friends and long-term outreach work partners began to advocate for an alternative. We believed that if the city of Olympia was going to be passing these ordinances, that they had a responsibility to care for those that were most affected by them. We wanted to open a shelter that took all of their complex challenges into consideration and screened them in because of it, rather than leaving them out on the streets. This idea came with great hesitation, concern, critique, and luckily, enough support to get it going. On November 1st of 2014, we opened the doors of the Interfaith Works Emergency Overnight Shelter. We are a 37-bed shelter for highly vulnerable single adults. We've been at 100% capacity since our second week of operations, and we still turn people away nearly every single night for lack of space. We've assisted over 30 people into their move into housing, connected people with chemical dependency treatment services, mental health support, medical doctors. We've provided shelter for 80 unique individuals, 3 cats, and 10 dogs. When people are given access to the resources that they need, really amazing things can happen. Our shelter is based on a model called Housing First. It's a model that's recently been gaining notoriety across the United States, and it is exactly what it sounds like. Provide people with safe, secure housing first, without any requirements for receiving that housing, and they're much more likely to get off the streets, out of the ER, out of jail, and get connected to services. This is Dee Dee. Yeah. Dee Dee had been homeless for about 3 years by the time she came to us. She was part of a list that I received from the Olympia Police Department of people that were frequently ending up in police custody because they had been screened out of everywhere else. But before Dee Dee was homeless, she had her own apartment, owned her own car. She frequently babysat for her grandchildren.
I'm sorry. I feel like I just messed this up. Hang on. There we go.
But Dee Dee also had some really challenging behavior, and a lot of this had to do with her decreased mental health and also an increase in symptoms of dementia in more recent years. She had received trespass notifications from many downtown businesses, social service agencies, the library, even the local food program fed her outside because her behavior was too hard to manage indoors. But we had screened Dee Dee in, and we weren't letting her go. The other thing about Dee Dee is that she had racked up quite a bill. Between citations, interactions with police, jail bookings, and hospital visits, in the year before we got Dee Dee into housing, she cost taxpayers $250,000 in 1 year. So just for some comparison, one night at St. Peter Hospital, $2,500. One night in Olympia City Jail, $104. One night at our shelter, $24. When people are given access to the resources that they need, really big things can happen.
I think I'm just gonna, you should watch the rest of it, but I think I'm gonna stop it there just for the interest of time. You know, obviously this isn't a typical fundraising video. This is a TED Talk, but I just wanted to give you guys a couple different examples of ways that we can tell the story of the work that we're doing. And yes, I can share the link so you can watch the rest of it. I wanted to just spend a few minutes just seeing what you noticed in terms of the differences between those approaches, what you feel like worked, thinking about kind of all those things that we talked about, framing devices, visuals, the use of numbers, the use of language, like what kind of words people were using to describe the problem or the solution. Anybody want to share?
And folks can feel free to come off mute and share, or you can just text, or you can type it in the chat box. Either way works.
Either way.
I mean, I think the second video is definitely more communal. And when you mentioned language, the way that the presenter spoke about how, I guess the only example I can remember, she specifically said taxpayers, but kind of framing it in a way that it affects everyone. It affects everyone in the community, these issues. So, but that type of language stood out to me in that second one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. The use of the use of numbers in that way was an interesting framing device for sure. And it was definitely more of a communal, you see how you widen the frame more. She gives so much context for, you know, just in terms of like city policies and those kinds of things that are contributing to the issue. She also used the language of like access to resources when people are given access to resources. So even though she's talking about the shelter, it almost feels like she's not necessarily centering the organization, but she's focusing more on the issue. And so I think in some ways it's interesting to think about, you know, really centering your issue and thinking about presenting your organization as part of an ecosystem, kind of addressing the issue. So where does your organization fit within this community trying to tackle these complicated, complex things? And so you can still see how she wove personal stories. I mean, she started with a really compelling story. She also really emphasized that she had access to resources. She had family support and money in order to get the help that she needed, and a friend in Olympia. And she talked a lot about her community, you know, and so a lot of times, you know, thinking about ways that we can tell stories that really emphasize people's strengths, that don't focus so much on deficits and show their relationship within their community. And that our organizations are one piece of a larger thing. I mean, it's tricky because we want to make a compelling case for support, clearly. And we, you know, we do, and every organization does unique and interesting work, and we want to make sure that we share that. And, you know, just expanding, opening our frame a little bit. So our organization's maybe not at the center, but just a part of this larger ecosystem, kind of helping to move things forward is kind of one approach that you can take. Anybody else want to share anything in relation to those two examples before I move on? Okay. So I'm gonna, whoops, sorry, just unshared. So I still really feel like we need stories, we need connection, we need heart-centered connection within our community. So I think the difference, sometimes like the more thematic or storytelling can be kind of get us here as opposed to here. And when we're talking about issues, we're often kind of intellectualizing things. But when we're hearing somebody's personal experience, we're here. And I think that's kind of what helps to sort of build community in some ways, is being in kind of a heart-centered place. But you know, it's tricky to do that in a way that we don't, we're not kind of exploitative of the people that we're working with. And so I think Meg Martin's TED Talk is a good example of something that can be both heart-centered, but also sort of communal because of the way that she kind of used those personal stories in her larger narrative. So here's a few ideas of kind of what you can do. Moving beyond, we talked about this, so moving beyond the personal mode, telling stories that are rooted in a local collective we. Yes Magazine is a great example of this. They do really good storytelling in communities. Thinking about our inherent interdependence. I think somebody mentioned that as a fundraising, you know, part of what fundraising is interdependence. You know, emphasizing our strengths, our shared purpose, that we all benefit, we're all in this together, we all just have different roles to play, right? So, you know, you can have multiple people in your videos telling stories from their own unique perspective, and not, and just kind of how they're invested in their own role. Providing, like, again, just providing that context is super important. So I'm gonna move on to the next one. So in terms of thinking about an ethical process for sharing personal stories, one of the biggest things I'd recommend is sort of relinquishing the control of the frame. So one of the things that could be really useful is creating sort of a diverse work team to participate on the process of framing your stories. So if you want to do a storytelling project within your organization, consider bringing together 3, 5, 7 people, and having, you know, people who are sort of who maybe have most at stake, who are centered in that process. So inviting program participants, clients to participate in the process of thinking through what kind of stories do we want to tell as an organization. Investing in the process. So I would really suggest, I know that there's a tendency to want to do things in-house, and I think that that works for certain types of storytelling. You know, the more sort of like, if your director wants to connect with your audience and does a quick little video on the phone or something, thanking people, or that kind of video storytelling. But I think it's important to keep in mind that if you're trying to tell a more complex story, that it's important to have people with the right skills doing that with you. So one small example, when I was in graduate school and I was doing a film, it was kind of my first real film. And I was going back to the people who were in it to get their feedback. And one of the people who was featured just really hated the way she looked in her interview. And a lot of it had to do with my inexperience of like the camera lens, the camera angle, and the lighting. And it just didn't make her look very good. And so I wound up reshooting it. And so I think we have to keep that in mind too, that people want to be, I mean, it's like a horrible feeling to have when somebody like posts a picture of you on Facebook and you hate the way you look in it. So production companies can really bring that, where they have the skills and the tools to sort of like help present people in their best light. That's an important piece of it. Providing financial compensation is really important. So think about paying people for their time. You know, they're spending time to tell their story. Think about what that could look like. If you invite people to participate in kind of an intensive advisory group process, think about paying them to be a part of that. Finding the right company is really important. So ensuring that the production company really shares your values, understands how you want to work with program participants, and center the sort of relationship over the story. So it's really important that, you know, if you're inviting people to share personal experiences with your program or service, that the most important thing is them and your relationship to them. And if the story falls apart, then, well, that's just, I think, yeah, not as important, I think. So there's a really good resource, the community-centric fundraising model of fundraising. And there's an organization up in Seattle that has a lot of really, really good resources and in relations to that. And thinking about ways to work with program participants, there was an article that came out a little bit ago about that from somebody who used to be kind of a program participant who told their stories quite a bit. And so I thought I'd share kind of what she said is helpful. And this is really very in line with how I've operated as well with my storytelling projects. So if you're going to invite somebody to participate, you could consider putting out an open call and seeking enthusiastic consent. So recognizing that, you know, there is kind of a power dynamic. People might feel a sense of obligation. Maybe they've gotten a lot of benefit from your program or service that you've provided, and they feel an obligation to sort of give back, and maybe they don't totally want to do it. So just make sure that whoever is participating is very enthusiastic about being a part of that process. Make sure that you're individualizing things as much as possible. So you're meeting people in person, setting your expectations, you're being very transparent, explaining the whole process. So understanding, like, again, I mentioned earlier, you know, just being really clear about the steps. So we're going to invite you to participate in an interview, and we'd like it to be at this location, and then we'll need, you know, another 2 hours of your time to do. So just being really clear about like the time commitment that you're asking of them, you know, where you might, what transportation they might need to get there. Think about how you're going to share the story, and being really clear about, you know, where the story is going to be shared, and that they understand all of that as well. Asking permission throughout the process and feedback is really important. So make sure you build into your process that there's a feedback loop. So before you publish anything, you know, making sure that you get feedback. And this is where production companies can get a little nervous because they don't want to have to redo the video, but it's also really important if somebody doesn't feel good about how they're presented in the video, that they're a part of that editing process and the feedback process. It's important to have a backup plan. So, you know, in the oral history world, we talk about ongoing consent. And so what that means is, you know, you need to get consent from people all along the way. So you might want to use the video for a fundraiser, and you get permission for that. You might want to use it on your website. You might get permission for that, but it's important to kind of check back in with folks. So, you know, if you have a video up on your website that you've had up for a year or something, I would suggest getting back in touch with people who are in that and just say, hey, you know, we still are using your video that you're in, you know, still on our website. Can you take a look and make sure that you're feeling good about it being up there still? People kind of forget, I think. And it's also a good opportunity for you to maintain relationships with people. That's how I always think about it. So, you know, there was a time where people would just sort of sign the rights away with these release forms, and then you kind of own the copyright to everything. But I think for me, you know, asking for permission for specific uses and then going back to people is a really good practice, because it just strengthens your relationship, and new things kind of evolve from that as well, from those processes of like looping back with people. And then, you know, this is just ongoing work, is managing donor expectations and interactions. So, you know, when I was at the Dispute Resolution Center, we did, you know, our big fundraiser, which was at the Red Lion. There was like 500 people that would come, and we would work with clients to tell their stories on stage in front of folks. And we would always make sure that they had their own table, that they invited people that could be a part, you know, be there with them. We would kind of coach them through what to expect at that event. And that they had like a community or a support network kind of at the event. So they weren't kind of all on their own. And if they didn't have people to bring, then we would make sure that they would, you know, there's somebody they could staff or volunteers that they could sit with at their table. So just kind of giving them that support. And then kind of thinking long-term about storytelling. You know, we talked a little bit, I didn't really talk too much about this, but just this idea of sort of transactional versus relational storytelling. So again, sort of moving, I think people are doing this already. So just moving away from the donor-centric, the sort of, you know, donor as hero, organization as hero, that's really transactional, to moving more towards like a community-centric. So sort of widening that frame. Thinking about how you fit within this larger community and how we're all sort of interdependent and benefit from these issues being addressed. You know, a lot of this too is just, as I'm sure you know, a long-term relationship with your donors, meaningful ways to engage with the issue over time. And then the other thing too is just a commitment to breaking down the sort of the staff donor client divide in ways that are appropriate and safe. So building community around that shared purpose. So those are sort of more bigger picture, long-term things around storytelling. I think that's all I'm gonna say for today. This is a good resource too. So this is a book, I can send the link to this too, if you're really interested in storytelling. This is a really good resource called Curated Stories, but I can send more information about that if you're interested. So we just have a few minutes, and I wanted to see if folks had any questions at this point. We just have about 5 minutes left. There are things that they wanted me to clarify.
This is Shauna from Habitat for Humanity, and I was just curious, do you guys have a standard release that you use, and is that something or a resource you'd be willing to share?
Yeah, I mean, I have a release form that I use for our oral history projects. It's a little different, but I'd be happy to share it with you. I feel like I felt a lot of discomfort with a lot of the way that release forms have been, because they just feel very legal and very, I mean, I guess in some ways they are, but I think for me, I'm just as much as possible wanting to reinforce that, you know, the copyright always belongs to the person who's telling the story. And that it's kind of like specific ways that we're asking to use the story. So that's kind of how I've approached release forms. But I'd be happy to share if that's useful.
Thank you. That would be very helpful.
Yeah, I guess Emily's asking the same. Mm-hmm.
Also, one more question. Sorry, this is Shauna again. Do you have a list of local videographers that you work with, or that you would recommend? We're currently sourcing things, and as we reach out to people, it's been hard to find somebody and hard to know how to budget a videography project.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know that there's some local folks. I feel like Cabin Light Studios does a lot of work with nonprofits. Yeah, I mean, my organization does some too, but I think, yeah, I think that's the one that most comes to mind. I can think about it too and send some ideas as well.
We just reached out to Miguel from Cabin Light, but I guess they changed their name to Porcupine Media.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, it's hard. You're right. It is hard to budget for this kind of thing. Yeah. What do you have anything in particular that you're wanting to think through in terms of budgeting?
Well, if it's more project-based or like the number of days of shooting, like with a photographer, I typically know there's like a shot list and this is what their cost per hour. And then there's editing on the back end. And I'm wondering if it's the same for video or if it's higher, like what's an average cost per hour? What's high, what's low, what's in the median?
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, basically there's three, I'll just say this quickly, but there's three kind of phases. There's sort of the pre-production, production, and post-production. So the pre-production is kind of when you're getting to understand who you're working with and the story that you want to tell. And the production usually can be 1 to 2 days. Typically when I do it, it's usually like I do, you know, a day for interviews, and then I edit, and then I figure out what kind of B-roll to shoot in relation to that. So how do you want to visually tell the story? And after you have the interview and the structure of the story, and then the, you know, the post-production's the editing. So it's usually a couple days. And I'd have to look, it's, to be honest, I haven't, I feel like I think like $75 an hour is typical for like video editing services, and then people usually charge like half day or full day rates for their video production. And I have to look and see kind of what we've done in the past that I think is kind of typical for other groups. I think if you look on some websites, they'll even tell you. Yeah. But I think, you know, and some people might quote just to, you know, give you a quote just for the video, but I think it's anywhere from like $2,500 to $5,000 for like a 3-minute video that features maybe 3 people.
That is super, super helpful to know. And that triggered kind of another question for me of pre-production. Do you, as a videographer or somebody that works in it, want us to come with a storyline and exactly what we want, who our audience is going to be, what the goal of the film is going to be? Like, how dialed in should we be before we contact a videographer?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you should be somewhat. I think you should have some idea of who, you know, who you think would be good, and have some people on board already who you want to feature in your video. I mean, I think they can help to some extent with that, but I would really do a lot of that work beforehand. The pre-production for me, but I think I'm kind of strange, to be honest, because I actually meet with people ahead of time. So everybody I'm interviewing, I meet with them ahead of time to understand who they are first. Most production companies just go in and shoot video interviews of people, but I don't do that. So Yeah. So I think as much as you can kind of have things teed up ahead of time, because they'll just go in and interview people really, you know, you might work together with them a little bit on questions and things. I don't know if that helps.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and thanks so much for everyone for coming, and thank you, Elaine, for all of this wonderful information. I want to respect people's time, and I know it's, you know, the Thursday, so you probably got some stuff to do before the weekend. So I just want to thank everyone for coming today. I also want to let everyone know that, yeah, we will be able to put this recording from this session and some of the materials that folks were asking Elaine for, we're going to go ahead and we'll be putting them up on the spsgives.org website in the next day or two. So you can go ahead and keep an eye out for that, and also check out some of the other workshops that are available. Hopefully you can join us and Elaine for some other wonderful workshops later this summer. But yeah, so if people want to go ahead and get going, I don't know if Elaine has a couple minutes to stay on in case people have last minute questions that she can answer.
Yeah, we can.
But I think with that, I think we're going to come to a close, and yeah, just thank you all again.
Thank you, everybody.
And yes, I will make sure to send in an email, the link to where everything, all the materials are posted. All right.